A new beginning. Julia Hayes had always been dedicated to her work as a nurse, her days spent caring for patients and managing the chaos of the hospital. Yet nothing had prepared her for the life-changing moment that would forever alter the course of her existence. It was a typical Thursday evening when the unexpected happened, and fate decided to intervene. The evening air was cool and refreshing, a welcome reprieve after a long shift in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital. Julia stepped out of the building, her feet aching from hours of walking the hospital corridors, her body tired, but her mind still sharp. She glanced at her watch, realizing there was enough time for a quick trip to the grocery store before heading home. Her refrigerator, like always, was empty, and the thought of cooking something warm made her stomach growl in anticipation. As she walked toward her car, her mind was already drifting toward the list of items she needed to pick up. Milk, eggs, some fresh produce. It was a simple, routine task. But as she approached her car, a faint sound caught her attention. It was a cry, soft and weak, floating through the evening breeze. Julia froze, her trained instincts instantly alert. She turned her head, trying to locate the source of the sound. Again, the cry echoed in the distance. It wasn't the loud wail of a child in distress, but something more subtle, a muffled whimper, as though someone was trying to hide the sound. Julia's heart began to race as she moved closer to the alley beside the hospital. Her eyes darted around, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a small crumpled bundle near a rusty trash bin. Her breath caught in her throat as she hurried toward the spot. There, lying abandoned in the dirt, was a newborn baby boy, wrapped in a filthy, tattered blanket. His tiny face was scrunched in discomfort, and his cries were pitiful, the sound desperate. Julia knelt down, her hands trembling as she carefully unwrapped the blanket, revealing the tiny, fragile child beneath. His skin was dark, his hair black and damp from the tears that stained his face. The overwhelming sense of protectiveness washed over Julia, and she felt her heart break for this innocent child left alone in the world. "Oh my goodness," Julia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her mind raced as she held the baby close to her chest, feeling the warmth of his tiny body against her own. "You poor little thing. Don't worry, you're safe now." The baby's cries softened as he nestled against her, his tiny hand instinctively curling around her finger. Julia's eyes welled with tears as she looked down at the fragile infant in her arms. She couldn't imagine how or why someone could abandon such a vulnerable soul. She gently lifted him into her arms, cradling him against her body, and hurried to her car. Her thoughts were a blur of questions. Who could have done this? Why would anyone leave a baby all alone? But as much as she wanted to know the answers, the only thing that mattered right now was getting the baby the care he needed. As she drove back to the hospital, Julia couldn't help but glance at the baby, her mind still reeling. The child, despite his rough start, was still alive, still breathing, still in need of love and care. Her heart ached as she thought of his uncertain future. She didn't know what would happen to him, but she knew one thing. She couldn't just let him slip through the cracks. She would do whatever it took to ensure this little one had a chance at a better life. The hospital's emergency entrance came into view, and Julia pulled up to the door with determination. She rushed inside, her footsteps quick as she made her way through the familiar hallways. The nurse at the front desk looked up in surprise as Julia approached, the baby still nestled securely in her arms. "I found him outside," Julia said breathlessly, her voice steady despite the emotions whirling inside her. "I need help. He's just a baby. He was abandoned." The nurse nodded quickly, moving to assist Julia. Within moments, the baby was being examined by a team of doctors and nurses. Julia stood off to the side, her heart pounding as she watched them work. The child was in good hands now, but she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that gnawed at her. Dr. Grayson, the pediatrician on call, approached her after a short while. His kind face was solemn, though his tone was reassuring. "Julia, the baby's stable. He's a little dehydrated, but otherwise, he's healthy for now." He gave her a reassuring smile. You did the right thing by bringing him in. Julia let out a sigh of relief, her tense shoulders finally relaxing. Thank you, Dr. Grayson. I don't understand. How could anyone leave him out there like that? The doctor's expression softened. It's a tragic situation, but at least he's here now. He's got a chance. Julia nodded, though her mind was still racing. She had done what she could, but she knew the hard part was only just beginning. No family had come forward to claim the child, and while Julia understood the need to alert the authorities, a deep, unsettling sadness settled in her chest at the thought of the baby being taken away. Can I see him? Julia asked, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Grayson smiled kindly. Of course. Follow me. Julia followed the doctor to the nursery, where the baby boy lay in a small crib. His dark eyes were wide, his gaze curious as he looked up at her. Julia's heart skipped a beat as she approached the crib. She had never expected to feel such a powerful connection to a child she had only just met, but in that moment she felt it, an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility. Hi there, little one, she said softly, reaching out to gently stroke his cheek. The baby gurgled, and for the first time, he smiled, his tiny hand reaching up to grasp her finger. In that moment, Julia knew she had made a decision. No matter the cost, she would ensure that this baby, this beautiful child, was not alone. As the days passed, Julia found herself returning to the hospital every day, spending hours holding the baby and caring for him. She learned his cries, the way he reached for her, the way his face lit up when he saw her. He became a part of her world, and she couldn't imagine her life without him. But Julia knew the time would come when decisions had to be made. The baby's future was uncertain, and the thought of losing him was a pain she wasn't sure she could bear. Still, she knew she had to be strong for him. She wasn't ready to become a mother, but she couldn't ignore the undeniable pull in her heart. And one question kept resurfacing in her mind. Was this her chance? Was this little boy the family she had always dreamed of, even though it seemed impossible? The answers, Julia realized, would come in time. But for now, she had a responsibility to this child. And no matter what, she was determined to give him the love and care he deserved. Her journey with Elijah was just beginning. A growing connection. The days following Julia's decision to take in the abandoned baby boy, whom she had named Elijah, felt like a blur of emotions and new routines. It was as if her life had been split into two worlds, before Elijah and after Elijah. Her once solitary existence had transformed overnight. The quiet of her apartment, which she had once cherished for its simplicity, now felt empty without the soft, rhythmic sounds of a baby's breathing filling the space. Julia had never imagined motherhood in such a way. She had always been focused on her career, her identity wrapped up in the work she did as a nurse, helping those in need. But the moment she held Elijah in her arms, something inside her shifted. There was a fierce, protective love that welled up within her, a love that was entirely new, yet felt as natural as breathing. She remembered that first night she brought Elijah home, the feeling of his tiny body in her arms, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. It had been a long day, and Julia's hands had shaken slightly as she prepared his small crib by the side of her bed. She had spent hours making sure everything was just right, blankets, toys, and baby supplies meticulously arranged. But as she stood over the crib that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a temporary arrangement. It was the start of something bigger. She had no idea how long Elijah would stay with her, but deep down, she knew she had already grown to love him. More than that, she knew that she couldn't bear the thought of him being taken away. But she also understood that there were rules, systems, and processes that she couldn't ignore. As much as she wanted to keep Elijah in her life forever, the future remained uncertain. For now, all she could do was focus on the present. She woke up every morning to the sound of Elijah's soft cooing, his tiny hand reaching out for her as soon as he opened his eyes. She fed him, changed him, sang to him, and rocked him to sleep, her heart swelling with every little gesture. Each day brought new milestones. The first time he smiled at her, the first time he reached for her face, the first time he gurgled a sound that seemed to be a baby's version of laughter. Julia had never thought she would find joy in the small, mundane moments of motherhood. But with Elijah, everything felt new and special. She even began to cherish the late-night feedings, those quiet, still hours when the world outside was asleep, and it was just her and Elijah, bonding in the silence. She had never been one to believe in destiny, but she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, this was meant to be. As the weeks went by, the connection between Julia and Elijah deepened. He was no longer just a child she had found in the alley. He had become a part of her family in ways she had never expected. Her days were filled with trips to the park, doctor's appointments, and playtime in the living room. Every day was a new adventure, each moment more precious than the last. But despite the warmth that filled her heart, there were moments of doubt, moments when Julia questioned whether she was truly cut out for motherhood. There were days when Elijah was fussy, when nothing seemed to calm him, and Julia would sit by his crib, holding back tears of frustration. She wasn't a mother by birth, and at times, the weight of the responsibility felt overwhelming. What if she wasn't doing enough? What if he needed something she couldn't provide? These thoughts plagued her mind, but she pushed them aside, determined to give him the best life she could. One evening, as she sat on the couch, rocking Elijah to sleep in her arms, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it absently, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Maria, the social worker who had been involved in Elijah's case since he had been brought into the hospital. Julia's heart skipped a beat as she opened the message. "Hi, Julia. Just wanted to check in on Elijah. I know it's been a few weeks, and I hope everything is going well. We may need to talk soon about the next steps, but I wanted to let you know that we're still searching for his biological family. I understand this is a difficult situation, but we're doing everything we can to find out more. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns." Julia read the message over and over again, her stomach twisting. The thought of Elijah being taken from her was something she had tried not to dwell on, but it loomed over her every day. She had tried to tell herself that she was just his temporary guardian, that the system would figure out what was best for him. But the reality was that she didn't want to let him go. The bond they shared was too strong. Elijah had become her son in every way that mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the search for Elijah's biological family continued, but no one came forward. Despite the best efforts of social services, there was no trace of the baby's origins. It was a mystery that weighed heavily on Julia's mind. Who was this child? Why had he been abandoned? And most importantly, why had no one come looking for him? One afternoon, as Julia sat in the hospital cafe sipping her coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest. She had grown so attached to Elijah that the idea of losing him seemed unbearable. She tried to push these thoughts aside, but they kept creeping back, especially during the quiet moments of the day when she wasn't busy caring for him. Her best friend, Megan, had been a constant source of support during this time. The two had known each other for years, their friendship forged through long shifts and shared laughs in the break room. Megan had been the first person Julia had confided in about Elijah, and she had been nothing but encouraging. "Jules, you've got this," Megan had said during one of their many coffee shop sessions. "You're stronger than you realize. And Elijah, he's lucky to have you. You're the best thing that could have happened to him." Julia had smiled, but the doubt still lingered in her heart. Was she really ready to be a mother? Could she handle the responsibility? And if she became too attached, what would happen if Elijah's real family showed up? She didn't want to lose him, but she also knew that the system was designed to reunite children with their biological families whenever possible. The thought of Elijah being taken away tore at her, but she knew that if it came to that, she had to be strong for him. One night, as Julia tucked Elijah into his crib, she whispered a prayer to the universe. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would fight for Elijah. She would do whatever it took to give him the life he deserved, whether it was with her or someone else. The love she felt for him was real, and no matter what the future held, she would always cherish the time they had together. But little did Julia know, as she settled into her quiet life with Elijah, the mystery of his past was far from over. Secrets lay hidden, and one day, a letter would arrive that would change everything. A growing connection. As the months passed, Julia's life became a delicate balance of caring for Elijah and navigating the looming uncertainty about his future. The child who had once been a helpless, abandoned infant had grown into a joyful, curious toddler with big eyes full of wonder. His laughter had become the soundtrack of Julia's days, filling the small apartment with an energy she had never known. The more time she spent with Elijah, the more she felt a deep, undeniable connection. There were moments when he would hold her hand tightly, his small fingers grasping hers with a trust so pure it made Julia's heart swell. Each milestone he reached was a triumph for them both. His first steps, his first words, his first time calling her Mama. And though she wasn't his biological mother, every moment felt like proof that she was meant to be in his life. But with every passing day, the weight of the unknown pressed heavier on her shoulders. Despite the joy Elijah brought her, the looming question of his biological family, his true identity, remained unanswered. Julia couldn't help but wonder about the child's past, even though she had chosen to focus on his present. Who were his parents? Why had they abandoned him? What was his story before he'd been left by the hospital dumpster? She had spent countless hours looking through Elijah's case file, trying to find any clue that might explain his situation. But the file was sparse, just a few notes from social services, reports about his medical condition when he had arrived at the hospital, and an anonymous tip from a passerby who had heard the baby's cries. No one had come forward to claim him, and no one had given any indication of who might be missing him. It was as though Elijah had appeared out of nowhere. Julia had tried to push these questions aside, telling herself that it didn't matter. What mattered was that Elijah was safe, that she was doing her best to care for him. But deep down, she knew that she couldn't ignore the mysteries surrounding his past forever. And then came the day when everything began to change. It started like any other afternoon. Julia had just returned from a pediatric appointment for Elijah, who was now 3 years old, and she was preparing a light lunch in the kitchen when she heard a soft knock at the door. It was a quiet, unassuming knock, one that didn't alert her to anything out of the ordinary. But something about it felt off. Julia felt a strange twinge of unease in her stomach as she wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward the door. When she opened it, she was met with an unexpected sight. A large envelope, sealed with wax, was resting on her doorstep. There was no return address, no indication of who had left it. Just the envelope, heavy and official-looking, staring back at her. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't been expecting any mail, especially not something so formal. She bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling slightly as she held it in her grasp. The envelope was thicker than most, and it had a strange weight to it. As she brought it inside, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Could it be a letter from social services, or perhaps from Elijah's biological family? She set the envelope down on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a moment. There was no sense in delaying the inevitable. With a deep breath, she tore open the seal and unfolded the letter inside. As she read the words, her hands began to shake. To Julia Hayes, we hope this letter finds you well. We are writing to you concerning the child you are currently caring for, Elijah. There is something we must tell you, something you deserve to know. Elijah is not who you think he is. We know this may come as a shock, but the truth is far more complicated than you could ever have imagined. Please contact us at the number provided below. It is imperative that we speak as soon as possible. The letter ended abruptly, with no further explanation. Just a phone number scrawled in bold black ink. Julia's breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the letter again and again. Her mind was spinning. Elijah was not who she thought he was. What did that mean? What truth could this letter be referring to? Her thoughts immediately raced to the worst possibilities. Had someone finally come forward to claim Elijah? Or worse, had they discovered something about his past that would put him in danger? For a moment, Julia stood frozen, the letter trembling in her hands. The calm, predictable life she had built with Elijah felt like it was being threatened in an instant. Everything she had worked so hard to protect, everything she had come to love, was suddenly at risk. She couldn't let this unknown person take him from her. She couldn't lose him. But she also knew she had no choice but to find out what the letter meant. She had to know the truth for Elijah's sake. Taking a deep breath, Julia grabbed her phone and dialed the number written on the bottom of the page. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "Hello, this is Angela. How can I help you?" Julia's heart raced as she tried to steady her voice. "I received a letter today about Elijah, the child I'm fostering. I need to know what this is all about." There was a long pause on the other end, a deep, almost painful silence before Angela spoke again. "I'm so sorry you had to hear it this way, Julia. But it's time you learned the truth. Elijah is not just a baby who was abandoned. He's part of something much bigger than you realize. And you need to meet with us in person. There's a lot we need to explain." Julia's head spun. "What do you mean? What are you talking about? What's going on with Elijah?" Angela's voice softened, almost as if she were choosing her words carefully. "Julia, I know this is a lot to take in. But Elijah's past is tied to a larger story, one that you may not understand yet. Please, I'm asking you, meet with us. It's important. It's about Elijah's safety and the people he's connected to." The line went silent for a moment as Julia tried to process what Angela was saying. Her heart pounded in her chest. What was this about? Was Elijah's past something dark and dangerous? Had she unknowingly brought him into a situation that was far beyond her control? "I'll meet with you," Julia finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I need to know more. I need to know why he was abandoned, and what all of this means." Angela's voice was calm, yet urgent. "We'll tell you everything, I promise. Just be careful. The truth you're about to uncover will change everything." After hanging up, Julia sat in silence, staring at the letter in her hands. Her mind was a storm of questions, but there was one thing she knew for certain. Her life, and Elijah's, was about to be upended. The secrets of his past were finally coming to light, and with them, the possibility of a revelation so shocking it could tear apart the life they had carefully built together. But as terrified as she was, Julia made a vow in her heart. No matter what came to light, she would protect Elijah. She would fight for him, because that was what a mother did. No matter what the truth was, she would face it head-on, and she would never stop loving him. Unraveling the truth. The night after the call from Angela, Julia lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The letter, with its cryptic message, seemed to echo in her mind like a ghost, haunting every thought, every moment. Elijah, the little boy she had come to love with all her heart, was somehow part of a larger, far more complex story than she had ever imagined. The idea that something could threaten their fragile bond filled her with a mixture of dread and confusion. What could possibly be so important that it had to remain hidden for so long? Her fingers trembled as she turned over the letter again, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. "Elijah is not who you think he is." The words were written plainly, but their weight seemed heavier with every glance. She had to meet with Angela, the mysterious woman on the other end of the phone. But the unknown was gnawing at her. Who was Angela? Why was she so urgent? What could she know about Elijah that would require such secrecy? Julia squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the overwhelming questions from her mind. For now, she needed rest. She needed clarity, and she knew that would only come when she finally understood what this was all about. The thought of meeting Angela in person, face to face, did nothing to calm her nerves. Instead, it only made her more anxious. What if Elijah was taken from her? What if everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was about to crumble? It was just after dawn when Julia decided she couldn't wait any longer. She got up, dressed in the first clothes she could find, and fed Elijah his breakfast. His wide, innocent eyes stared up at her as he ate his cereal, and for a moment, the weight of the world lifted. Elijah was still her son, and nothing would change that in her heart. "Are you ready to go, little man?" she asked, trying to sound cheerful. Elijah didn't respond with words yet, but he smiled brightly, his wide grin enough to warm her entire soul. She bent down to kiss his forehead, and for that brief second, she allowed herself to feel the pure joy of having him in her life. Nothing, no letter, no secret past, could take that away. After packing a small bag for Elijah and getting him dressed, Julia decided to meet Angela at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The address Angela had provided was in a part of the city Julia wasn't familiar with. It wasn't the kind of place where people casually met for coffee. Something about it felt strange, out of the ordinary. Julia's heart raced as she walked to the cafe with Elijah by her side, trying her best to look calm, to appear composed. The last thing she wanted was to let her fear show in front of him. The cafe was small and dimly lit, a quiet place with only a handful of patrons scattered across the room. At the far corner, sitting by a window, was a woman who could only be Angela. She had the same calm, almost too caring presence that had come through the phone line, but there was an underlying tension in her posture, like someone who had been waiting too long to speak, too long to tell the truth. Julia approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the room before she reached Angela's table. Elijah tugged gently at her hand, sensing the unease in her body language. She gave him a reassuring smile, but it did little to ease her own mounting anxiety. "Julia." Angela's voice was soft, but her gaze was steady as she stood to greet her. There was a warmth in her eyes, but also something else, something Julia couldn't quite place. She nodded, pulling out a chair for herself. "Yes, I'm Julia," she said, sitting down across from Angela, her voice quiet. "You said you have information about Elijah. What's going on? What is all this?" Angela's eyes flickered for a moment, and Julia could tell there was more to her than just the calm exterior. She hesitated before speaking, as though trying to find the right words to ease the bombshell she was about to drop. "Julia, you need to understand that Elijah's situation is not as simple as it seems," Angela began, her voice low but firm. "He's not just a child left in a dumpster by an unknown parent. His story is tied to something far bigger, and you need to be prepared for that." Julia felt her stomach lurch. The calm facade she had been holding on to began to crack, and she felt the faintest sense of panic rising in her chest. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Angela took a deep breath and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Elijah was never abandoned. Not in the way you think. He was placed there, on purpose, by people who cared for him, people who knew what was coming. His birth was part of a larger plan. There are people who want him back, people who are very powerful, and have been looking for him since he was born." Julia's mind struggled to make sense of the words. People who are looking for him. What kind of people? Why are you involved in all this? Angela glanced around nervously, as if to make sure no one was listening in. Her voice dropped even lower, her eyes darting around the room before she spoke again. "I'm part of a group that's been protecting Elijah, trying to keep him safe. We've been monitoring him for years, ever since he was born. His birth wasn't an accident. He was born into something extraordinary. And there are others who want to use him, control him. That's why he was abandoned, so he could escape." Julia's head was spinning. She reached for her coffee cup to steady herself, but found her hands trembling. "You're saying he's special? What are you talking about?" Angela nodded slowly. "Yes, Elijah is part of a family line with certain abilities. Abilities that make him very valuable to those who would use him for their own purposes. He's not like other children. His DNA, his very existence, could change the course of things in ways you can't even imagine. People have been searching for him for years. And the moment you found him, Julia, you became part of a much bigger story. You became the protector of someone who could change the world. Julia stared at Angela, the words hanging in the air between them. Her world, the quiet, predictable life she had built with Elijah, suddenly felt like it was collapsing. The truth about his origins was something she could never have prepared for. Her baby, the one she had held, loved, and raised, wasn't just a child in need of care. He was a key player in something larger, something dangerous. How is that possible? Why didn't anyone tell me about this sooner? Julia's voice was shaking now, the reality of what Angela was saying sinking in. Because Julia, Angela said gently, you needed to know when you were ready. The people who are after him, they would stop at nothing to get him, and we had to protect him, even if that meant keeping his true origins a secret from you. But now that you've become his mother, now that you've bonded with him, it's time you knew the truth. You're not just his foster mother anymore. You're the key to keeping him safe. Julia sat back in her chair, her heart pounding in her chest. Elijah was more than she ever imagined. And now, the weight of responsibility had shifted. She wasn't just protecting a child from neglect. She was protecting someone who could be the answer to questions he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone who would stop at nothing to take Elijah back. Julia. Angela's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The truth is this. Elijah's parents, they were part of a secret project. A project that involved genetic manipulation. A project to create children with extraordinary abilities. Elijah's birth was part of that plan. He's been hidden away for his own safety. And now people who were once part of that project are searching for him. Julia's head was spinning. And for a moment, she didn't know what to think. But as she looked at Elijah, playing with his toy in the corner of the cafe, her heart hardened with resolve. No matter what secrets Elijah's past held, no matter how dangerous it became, she would protect him. He was her son. Nothing could change that. And whatever the truth was, she was ready to face it. The burden of truth. The cafe around Julia seemed to fade away as Angela's words lingered in her mind. Elijah was no ordinary child. His birth, his existence, was tied to something far larger than anything she could have imagined. As Angela spoke, the weight of the situation pressed down on Julia like 1,000 pounds. She felt the ground shift beneath her, as though the life she had carefully built with Elijah was suddenly threatened by forces she couldn't yet understand. Elijah, who had once been just a helpless infant left alone in an alley, was now the key to something that could change everything. His DNA wasn't just human, at least, not in the way she had assumed. He was part of some kind of secret genetic project, born to fulfill a purpose beyond anyone's comprehension. And now, the people who had orchestrated his existence were searching for him. Her mind raced as Angela continued speaking. We've been watching over Elijah for years, trying to protect him. The group I'm a part of, we've kept him safe since his birth, hidden away from those who would use him for their own gain. But now that you've bonded with him, Julia, the situation has changed. You're the one who can help him stay hidden. Julia's thoughts were a whirlwind. Why me? She thought. Why did this have to happen now, after I've already become attached to him? She glanced down at Elijah, who was playing quietly with a toy on the floor, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around him. The love Julia had for him was fierce, almost primal. She couldn't imagine a life without him. But now that she knew the truth, she couldn't just ignore the implications of it. She couldn't let him stay hidden forever, not without understanding the full scope of what was happening. Angela, Julia said, her voice shaky but determined, you said that Elijah's parents were part of this project. What does that mean? What exactly was this project about? Angela's gaze hardened, and she leaned in closer as though ensuring no one else could hear. The project was an experiment, a series of genetic manipulations to create children with enhanced abilities. Elijah wasn't the only child involved, but he's one of the most important. His abilities are unique, stronger, more advanced than the others. He was meant to be part of a larger plan, a plan that could change the world. But something went wrong. Elijah's parents defected. They disappeared, and that's when we started protecting him. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to make sense of what Angela was saying. Enhanced abilities, genetic manipulation. The words didn't seem real. She had held Elijah in her arms, comforted him, laughed with him. He was a child, a little boy who loved her, who needed her. How could someone like him be a part of something so sinister? Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Julia asked, her voice breaking slightly. Why didn't I know anything about this before? Angela's eyes softened, and she sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping as though carrying the weight of an unbearable truth. It wasn't safe. If we had told you everything, if we had revealed the full extent of the situation, the people searching for him would have found him sooner. We needed to keep you and Elijah hidden, protected. And Julia, we were hoping you wouldn't need to know. But now that you're involved, now that you've become his mother, you need to understand the risks. Elijah's life, and your own, are in grave danger. The air seemed to grow thick with tension as Angela's words settled in. Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had already fallen so deeply in love with Elijah, but now that love carried a burden she had never imagined. She had to protect him from forces far beyond her control, forces that could do anything to reclaim him. Who exactly is after him? Julia asked, the question trembling on her lips. Who are these people, and what do they want with him? Angela's expression grew darker. The people after Elijah are not just ordinary criminals. They are part of a secret organization, one with vast resources, connections, and power. They've been hunting Elijah for years, trying to track him down, and they will stop at nothing to use him for their own purposes. There are others too. People who want to study his abilities, people who want to exploit him. You need to understand that he's more than just a child. He's a weapon. And right now, you are his only protection. Julia's mind was reeling. This couldn't be real. She had gone from being a nurse, a caregiver, to a protector of a child with powers she didn't understand, against enemies she didn't know. The idea of Elijah being a weapon made her stomach churn. He was just a little boy. How could something like that be true? Is there any way I can protect him? Julia whispered. What am I supposed to do? How do I keep him safe from people like that? Angela's eyes softened with sympathy, but there was no easy answer. You need to stay vigilant, Julia. You need to be careful who you trust. People are watching you. People who want to know where Elijah is. It's not just about keeping him hidden. It's about keeping you safe too. We can help you, but you need to be prepared. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. Julia nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was no longer just a nurse caring for a child. She was now a protector, a mother in every sense of the word, even if the world outside didn't see her that way. The stakes had never been higher. For a moment, there was silence between them. Julia looked at Elijah, who was still happily playing with his toy, unaware of the danger lurking just outside their small bubble of peace. Her heart ached as she watched him. This was no longer just about providing for him, loving him, or caring for him. This was about keeping him safe, no matter what it took. What do I need to do? Julia asked, her voice low but firm. Tell me what's next. Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. You need to leave town. For now. You can't stay in one place for too long. We'll help you move to a secure location, but we need to act quickly. The people who are looking for Elijah, they know more than we realize, and they're closing in. It's only a matter of time before they find you, and when they do, there will be no turning back. Julia felt a rush of panic at the thought of running, of uprooting everything and everyone she knew. But the reality of the situation couldn't be ignored. She looked at Elijah again, and the love she felt for him was stronger than any fear. This wasn't just about survival. This was about giving him the chance to live a life free of the shadow that had been hanging over him since the moment he was born. "Okay," Julia said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe. I won't let anyone take him from me." Angela nodded, a look of respect in her eyes. "You're stronger than you realize, Julia, but this isn't just about you anymore. It's about Elijah and the future he has. Stay close to me. I'll guide you through this, but we need to move fast." Julia took a deep breath. The path ahead was uncertain, full of danger and secrecy. But one thing was clear: she would fight with everything she had to protect Elijah. Whatever this strange, terrifying world was that had been thrust upon them, she would face it head-on. And no matter how dark it became, she would never let go of her son. The burden of truth. As Julia processed Angela's words, the weight of the situation pressed down on her harder than ever before. She had been thrust into a world of shadowy organizations, genetic manipulation, and powerful forces that wanted to control her son. She wasn't just a mother now. She was a soldier in a war she hadn't chosen. A war to protect her child from a past that she couldn't even begin to understand. Angela's phone buzzed, interrupting the heavy silence that had settled between them. She glanced down at the screen, her expression tightening, and quickly silenced the device. "We need to leave," Angela said, her voice now carrying an edge of urgency. "The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes. It's already too risky to stay in one place. I'll make the arrangements." Julia's heart hammered in her chest. The realization that she had no choice but to run hit her with full force. She couldn't go back to her life, couldn't return to the comfort of her apartment or the predictable routine that she had known. The world she had built for herself, the life she had carved out with Elijah, was now shattered. Everything was different, and as much as she tried to reassure herself, she knew deep down that there was no going back. "Where do we go?" Julia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Angela met her gaze, and for the first time, Julia saw a flicker of empathy in her eyes. "We have a safe house. It's off the grid, far from where anyone would expect us. But we have to leave now. They're closer than we thought, and I don't want to risk them finding you before we can get Elijah out of here." Julia nodded slowly, her thoughts running in every direction. She needed to keep Elijah safe. She had no choice. But the enormity of what was happening made her feel small, vulnerable, exposed. Everything was happening too fast, too suddenly. Angela stood up and pulled out a small, inconspicuous bag from underneath the table. "We've prepared everything. Clothes, money, documents. You need to keep a low profile from now on. We can't afford to leave any trace." Julia's stomach twisted. She hadn't signed up for this. She had only wanted to be a mother to a child in need. A child who had been abandoned. But now, Elijah's safety wasn't just about comforting him during the night or feeding him in the morning. It was about constant vigilance, constant fear of being discovered. Her life had become a series of evasions, a fight to protect a child she would die for. "How will we make sure they don't find us?" Julia asked, her voice betraying the doubt that had settled deep within her. Angela's lips tightened and her eyes darkened. "We've been monitoring the group that's after Elijah for years. They don't know everything. They don't know the safe houses, and they don't know about the network that's been protecting him. But we're running out of time. They're getting closer. You have to trust me, Julia. We'll get you both to safety." The mention of "we" made Julia pause. She had trusted Angela so far, but this was no longer just a matter of meeting someone's expectations or following orders. She was trusting her life, and Elijah's life, with a stranger. She couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. Could she really trust Angela? Could she trust anyone in this hidden world she had just been thrust into? But there was no other option. Elijah's life was in danger, and she had promised herself she would protect him, no matter the cost. "Okay," Julia said, her voice firm, even as her heart raced. "Let's go. I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe." Angela nodded sharply. "Good. We'll leave now. And we'll get you to the safe house. But we have to move quickly." The next hour passed in a blur as Julia gathered her things, trying to stay calm for Elijah's sake. She kept him close, holding his hand as they walked out of the cafe and into the cold, quiet afternoon. Angela led the way, her pace swift and purposeful, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting someone to jump out from behind every corner. For Julia, the world had turned into a labyrinth of danger. The streets seemed more crowded, the faces more suspicious. Every step she took felt like it could lead her into a trap. But she had no choice but to trust Angela. This was the only path forward. They made their way to a nondescript van parked a few blocks away. Julia barely had time to register the vehicle before Angela ushered her inside. The interior was unremarkable, with dark-tinted windows and minimal seating. Elijah, still innocent and unaware of the growing peril around him, climbed into the back seat without a word, his small body nestled into a seat that felt like it had been prepared for them. As the van started moving, Julia settled into the seat, clutching Elijah to her chest. She pressed her lips to his hair, trying to calm the fear that threatened to overtake her. Her mind was a blur, filled with the chaos of what had just happened, and the terrifying uncertainty of what lay ahead. Angela drove through the city streets, her eyes never leaving the road. Julia glanced out the window, noting how the buildings and familiar landmarks began to fade into unfamiliar rural terrain. They were leaving the city behind, heading toward the outskirts where no one would think to look. "This is just the beginning, Julia," Angela said, her voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. "Once we get to the safe house, we'll start laying the groundwork. We'll have to disappear completely. There's no telling when they'll figure out where we've gone, but we'll be ready. You have to trust me on this." Julia nodded, though she felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on her. "How long will we have to stay in hiding?" "As long as it takes," Angela replied, her voice hardening with determination. "But we need to move fast. Elijah's abilities, they're becoming more pronounced. People are starting to notice. That's why they'll be coming for him soon. They'll stop at nothing." Julia's pulse quickened. The thought of Elijah being more than just a child, of him being someone with powers, someone who could be a weapon, made her feel as though she were in a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. It was real. And no matter how terrifying it was, she had to keep her focus. She had to protect him. Hours later, the van pulled off the main road, winding through a series of back streets and dirt paths. The landscape was remote, surrounded by forests and empty fields, and Julia could feel the isolation of the place settling over her. Angela slowed the van and finally turned down a long, narrow dirt road that led to a small, secluded cabin nestled in the woods. "This is it," Angela said as she pulled the van to a stop. "This is where you'll be safe for now." Julia looked at the cabin, its modest structure surrounded by trees. It seemed like a world apart from the chaos that had consumed her life in the past few days. This would be their new home. For however long it took, she swallowed the lump in her throat, knowing that her life and Elijah's had irrevocably changed. But as she looked down at Elijah, still unaware of the danger they were in, a surge of love and protectiveness flooded through her. No matter what happened next, she would protect him. She would keep him safe from the people who wanted to control him, and she would fight for him with everything she had. Together, they would face whatever came next. The safe house and the secrets within. The cabin was small, rustic, but strangely comforting in its isolation. Situated in the heart of the forest, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to shield them from the outside world, it was the perfect hiding place, hidden away, far from prying eyes. Julia stepped out of the van, holding Elijah's hand tightly as she looked around. The quiet of the place was eerie in its stillness, a far cry from the busy, bustling city she had once called home. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant chirp of crickets, both of which seemed to remind her of how disconnected she had become from everything familiar. Angela motioned for Julia to follow her. "It's secure here. We've set up the cabin to be a safe house with layers of protection. You'll be able to rest, regroup, and plan. But we have to remain vigilant. We can't afford to let our guard down." Julia nodded, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The ride had been a blur of unfamiliar roads and quiet conversations, and now, standing in front of this simple cabin, the full weight of the situation finally began to sink in. This was no longer a matter of just helping a child who had been abandoned. This was survival. The world she once knew, her work as a nurse, her routines, felt like a lifetime ago. The truth about Elijah's origins had turned her life upside down. And now she was in hiding, fighting for the safety of a little boy who was connected to something far bigger than either of them could comprehend. Inside the cabin, Julia's eyes adjusted to the dim light. The space was modest, with a small living area, a tiny kitchen tucked in the corner, and a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom. It looked like any other cabin she might have seen on a weekend getaway, but there was an air of purpose here. Everything was organized, practical, and designed to keep them hidden. "This is where you'll sleep," Angela said, opening the door to the small bedroom. "It's the safest room in the house. We've reinforced the walls, and the windows have been coated with special film that blocks out any electronic surveillance. No one will be able to track us here." Julia took a deep breath and looked around. It wasn't much, just a simple bed, a dresser, and a small nightstand, but it was enough. It was enough for Elijah, for the two of them to have a place where they could catch their breath, even if only for a little while. She glanced at Elijah, who was still mesmerized by his surroundings, blissfully unaware of the gravity of their situation. "Are you okay?" Julia asked, crouching down to his level, her hand brushing his hair back from his face. Elijah gave her a small, innocent smile, his eyes wide with curiosity. He didn't understand what was happening, but in that moment, his smile was enough to calm her racing heart. "I'm fine," Julia whispered, her heart aching. "We're going to be okay, Elijah." But as she spoke the words, a knot of uncertainty tightened in her chest. She had no idea what okay meant anymore. The danger they were in was real, and the road ahead was uncertain. There were people, dangerous people, looking for them, and no matter how much Angela reassured her, Julia knew they couldn't afford to be complacent, not for a single moment. Angela walked into the room and closed the door behind her. "We need to talk about Elijah," she said, her tone more serious now. "We can't keep running forever. We need to figure out what to do next, and the truth about Elijah's abilities is something you need to understand. He's not like other children. His genetic makeup, what we've been trying to protect him from, isn't just a matter of physical strength or intelligence. There's something deeper, something that makes him a target." Julia listened intently, her chest tightening as the weight of Angela's words sank in. She had known, deep down, that there was more to Elijah than just his backstory. But hearing it from Angela, hearing the seriousness in her voice, made everything feel even more pressing. "What do you mean, something deeper?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Angela glanced around as if to ensure they were alone, and then took a deep breath. "Elijah's abilities, they're more than just physical traits. He has the ability to manipulate certain elements, energy, matter, even emotions. It's not fully understood yet, but he has the potential to alter reality in ways we can't yet predict. The people who want him, they know this. They know how powerful he could become, and they will do anything to control him." Julia's mind raced. Energy, matter, emotions. The very idea of Elijah being capable of such things was unfathomable. He was just a child, a little boy with a wild imagination, and a love for simple things like playing with his toys. She had never seen any sign of these abilities, never witnessed anything that would suggest he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a sweet, loving child in need of a home. But Angela was so certain. her voice full of conviction. She had to believe her. "But why hasn't he shown any of these abilities?" Julia asked, still struggling to wrap her mind around it. "Why now? Why hasn't anyone noticed it before?" Angela shook her head slowly, a look of sadness crossing her face. "It's a matter of control. Elijah's abilities are dormant for now. But as he grows older, as his body matures, his powers will awaken. And once they do, there will be no stopping him, or those who want to use him. The people after him have been tracking him for years, waiting for the moment when he'll reach his full potential. They believe he's the key to something bigger, something that could change the balance of power in the world." Julia felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. She had always known there was something special about Elijah. But this was something entirely different. She had thought her only responsibility was to care for him, to provide him with the love and support he needed to thrive. But now, she was learning that Elijah's existence was part of a much darker, more dangerous plan. And the people who wanted him weren't interested in love or care. They wanted power. She turned to Angela, her voice trembling. "What do we do now? How do we keep him safe from all of this?" Angela hesitated for a moment before answering. "The first step is to keep him hidden. We need to make sure no one can trace him. Not yet. But that's only a temporary solution. Eventually, the people who want him will find us. And when they do, we need to be ready. We'll need allies, people who can help us protect Elijah and keep him from falling into the wrong hands." Julia's heart sank. Allies? Who can we trust? How can we know who's on our side? Angela's face softened slightly, but her eyes remained resolute. "It's not easy, Julia. Trust is hard to come by in this world. But there are those who care about Elijah, who have been fighting for him, who are willing to risk everything to ensure he's safe. We'll reach out to them when the time is right. But for now, we need to focus on keeping Elijah's abilities hidden and making sure no one can find him." As the day turned to night, Julia couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had settled in her bones. The walls of the cabin, meant to protect them, now felt like a trap, confining them to a small, isolated world where danger could still find them. She glanced at Elijah, who was now curled up on the small couch, a peaceful look on his face as he drifted to sleep. She couldn't bear the thought of him being used as a pawn in some twisted game of power. "I won't let them take him from me," Julia whispered, more to herself than to Angela. "I'll protect him with my life." Angela's gaze softened, and for a moment, Julia saw the faintest hint of approval in her eyes. "I know you will, Julia, and I'll help you. But the journey ahead won't be easy. We have to be ready for anything." Julia nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. No matter what powers Elijah had, no matter how dangerous the people after him were, she would stand between him and the world that sought to control him. She would fight for him, protect him, and keep him safe, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had known before. Together, they would face whatever came next. A life on the run. The days at the cabin passed in a haze of uncertainty and constant vigilance. Julia's once peaceful life had been replaced by a relentless cycle of hiding, planning, and waiting. The safe house, nestled in the remote corners of the forest, provided a temporary refuge. But it was only that, temporary. Every creak of the wooden floors, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a ripple of tension through Julia. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that at any moment, someone would breach the calm facade and pull them back into the chaos they had escaped from. Elijah had adapted to the new life with surprising ease. He didn't understand why they couldn't leave the cabin, why they were always careful about who they spoke to, why Julia was constantly on edge. He was a child, too young to grasp the dangerous world around him, but his instincts seemed sharp, as if he could sense that things were different. Yet Julia did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy for him. She read him stories at night, played with him during the day, and tried to keep his life as ordinary as possible, despite the extraordinary dangers looming over them. Angela had stayed in touch, but only when absolutely necessary. Julia had grown used to the quiet phone calls that provided just enough information to keep her in the loop without revealing too much. She knew the group who had been watching over Elijah was still out there, still working behind the scenes to ensure his safety. But every day felt like a step closer to the moment when the people chasing them would find out where they were. The one thing Julia hadn't prepared for, though, was how much she would miss her old life. She had always been focused on her work as a nurse, dedicated to helping others, and though she had always felt a distance between herself and the patients she cared for, her life had been built around the routine. Now there was no routine, no familiar faces to greet, no patients to care for. The idea of returning to a normal life seemed like a distant dream. Instead, she was a fugitive, forced to live in hiding, with no clear path forward. One afternoon, after a long stretch of silence, Julia sat at the small kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands. Elijah was playing outside, his laughter carrying on the breeze, a stark contrast to the tension that clung to the cabin. Julia's fingers traced the rim of her cup, deep in thought. The only reason they were here was because Elijah had been abandoned by his real parents, who, as it turned out, had left him in a dumpster to protect him. They had placed him in the care of strangers, believing that, at least for a time, he would be safer that way. But who had they been hiding from? Who had forced them to make such a drastic decision? Julia's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, sharp and sudden. Her pulse quickened, and she rushed to the window to peek outside. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move by the trees. Heart pounding, she quickly checked that Elijah was still outside, playing as he always did, blissfully unaware. The knock came again, louder this time. Julia's hand trembled as she reached for the door. Who could it be? She had been so careful, so paranoid, but could someone have discovered their location? She pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. There was no sound, no movement. Finally, she opened it, only to be greeted by a figure standing just beyond the threshold. A tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in dark clothing, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. "Julia Hayes?" the man asked, his voice low but firm. "Yes," she said, standing her ground. Her mind raced. Who was this? And how did he know her name? Her hand hovered just above the gun Angela had left with her, hidden in a drawer. "I'm here to help," the man said, his voice steady but urgent. "I know you've been on the run, and I know about Elijah. I've been watching over him. Well, in a way. You need to come with me." Julia's heart skipped a beat. Watching over him. Was this another ally of Angela's, or was it someone else who had tracked them down? "Who are you?" Julia demanded, narrowing her eyes, unwilling to trust anyone she didn't know. The man looked around, as if checking for any signs of danger. He then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "My name is Tom. I work with Angela. She sent me to make sure you're okay. There's no time to explain everything right now, but you need to come with me. Elijah's not safe here anymore." Julia's mind raced. Who else knew where they were? How had Angela arranged this meeting without telling her first? But as she looked at the stranger before her, she saw no sign of deceit, just urgency, the same desperation that had plagued her since they had fled. "Why now? Why hasn't she contacted me herself?" Julia asked, her voice edged with suspicion. "She's been trying to keep things under the radar. Trust me, this is for your own safety. We've been monitoring the people searching for Elijah, and they've gotten too close. They've started targeting the people who are helping us hide him. We have to get him to another location, somewhere even safer." A wave of dread swept through Julia. "What do you mean, even safer? I thought we were already safe here." Tom shook his head, his eyes serious. "They're closing in, Julia, and we can't afford to wait any longer. There's a facility, underground, off the grid, where we can keep him safe. But you'll have to trust me. It's the only option left." Julia's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She wanted to keep Elijah safe, but she was terrified of leaving the only home they had known in months. The cabin, despite its isolation, had been their sanctuary. It had been their hiding place, the only place where they could breathe without fear of being discovered. But if Tom was telling the truth, and something in his eyes told her he was, then they couldn't afford to stay here. "Where's Elijah?" Tom asked, noticing that she hadn't moved. "We don't have much time. They're already on the move." Julia glanced out the window and saw Elijah's small form in the yard, kneeling down to examine a stick he had found. He was still so innocent, so unaware of the danger that loomed over him. The thought of moving him again, of uprooting him from this little piece of safety they had managed to carve out, made Julia's chest tighten. But she knew she had no choice. "Come on, we have to go," she said, turning to Tom. She grabbed her jacket and hurried outside, her mind still racing. The decision was made. Whatever the next step was, it had to be taken. She called out to Elijah as she walked toward him, trying to keep her voice calm. "Elijah, sweetheart, we need to go now." The boy looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes, his face lighting up in a smile. "Where are we going, Mama?" Julia's heart ached as she crouched down in front of him, brushing his hair back from his face. "We're going to visit a new friend, honey. It's going to be okay." As they walked toward the van, Tom already inside, Julia kept a tight hold on Elijah's hand, trying to ignore the gnawing fear that clawed at her insides. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what dangers lay ahead. But there was one thing she was certain of. She would keep Elijah safe. She would never stop fighting for him. The road ahead was uncertain, but Julia knew that her love for Elijah would be the one thing that could shield him from whatever darkness awaited them. As the van pulled away from the cabin, disappearing into the wilderness, Julia vowed to herself that she would never let go. No matter where they went, no matter the cost, she would protect him, for as long as it took.